Thucydides reports that in the second year of the war, in 430 BC, the Spartans and their allies marched on Athens and a terrible plague broke out in the besieged city. The plague was made worse by the fact that, in addition to the city dwellers themselves, the people from the countryside had retreated to within the city walls, and now everyone was living in close quarters in what must be imagined as to have been less than sanitary conditions. Thucydides explicitly refrains from reflecting on what might be the cause of the plague, and in this we can see his scientific spirit. At the end of his account of the plague, he recounts the oracle given to the Spartans, which people took to be an explanation. Quote, "When the god was asked whether they should go to war, he answered that if they put their might into it, the victory would be theirs, and he would himself be with them." With this oracle, events were supposed to tally, for the plague broke out so soon as the Peloponnesians invaded Attica. End quote. But Thucydides withholds judgment on this issue. As we've discussed, in the ancient world, plagues were usually conceived as having some divine origin. They were the punishment for some kind of offense to a god. Apollo was the god at the oracle at Delphi, and he was the god of light and the sun, and as we have mentioned in connection with the Iliad, was thought to be the cause of plagues. In his sober rationalism, Thucydides resists the temptation to seek the cause in divine agency. He tells how others interpreted the situation but withholds judgment himself. Instead of discussing the possible divine origin of the outbreak, Thucydides simply describes in detail the symptoms of the disease in the hope that it might be of help to doctors at some later time if the plague comes back again. His description of the symptoms is very detailed. This approach is something new. We saw nothing like this before in the accounts of plagues in earlier works, such as Homer's Iliad or Sophocles' Oedipus the King. This was the time when the field of medicine was just beginning to develop, and doctors were keen to identify diseases based on empirical observation of the symptoms. As we mentioned, the Greek physician Hippocrates wrote works on plagues and epidemics, although he did not play any role in the Athenian plague. When one compares Thucydides' account with that of Hippocrates, they seem very similar with regard to style. They are both acute observers who meticulously record what they have seen. Here, we see the beginning of the empirical method of science. This is an important step forward since it implies that there is a rationality in nature, even if it can't be immediately discerned, as in the case of the plague. Here, one can see that his scholarly approach to history is in line with a general scientific disposition towards the world. His stated goal of listing the symptoms of the disease so that this information can be of use to doctors later squares perfectly with his understanding of the goal of history to be of concrete use in the future. Thucydides recounts that no remedy for the disease could be found, and it continued to spread and claim victims throughout the city. One of the most interesting aspects of his narrative is the account of how the social order begins to break down during the plague. He says, quote, "As the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane." Sophocles' Antigone testifies to the importance of burial rites among ancient Greeks. This was regarded as a sacred duty that had to be observed with utmost care. Now, by contrast, in the plague, Thucydides recounts, quote, "All the burial rites before in use were entirely upset, and they buried the bodies as best they could. Many, from want of the proper appliances, through so many of their friends having died already, had recourse to the most shameless of sepultures. Sometimes, getting the start of those who had raised a pile, they threw their own dead body upon the stranger's pyre and ignited it. Sometimes they tossed the corpse which they were carrying on the top of another that was burning, and so went off." End quote. Thucydides reports the temples and sacred places, quote, "were full of corpses of persons that had died there." It was regarded as a great sacrilege to have a dead body in a temple, but presumably, due to the infectious nature of the disease, people were reluctant to remove the corpses. To the Greek mind, these were major breaches of custom and decency. If we think of Antigone again, we can appreciate the gravity of these infractions against what was regarded as the divine law. For Thucydides, this is the first sign of the beginning of the breakdown of the civil order. He refers to the new spirit of what he calls lawless extravagance, which began to take over. In normal times, People are ashamed to do certain criminal or immoral things in public. Worried about their honor or reputation, they perpetrated shameless acts in secret to maintain the veneer of respectability. Now all of this was gone, and people were doing things openly that they would not have dared to do during normal times. Quote, perseverance in what men called honor was popular with none, end quote. We have seen the central importance of honor in the Greek warrior ethic. This was important in Homer, and we saw it clearly appealed to in Pericles' funeral oration. The idea of it now being simply cast aside is again evidence of the radicality of the circumstances. The very values that, according to Pericles, made Athens great are now discarded. It's often thought that human beings obey laws since they regard them as being created by the gods and fear divine retribution for breaking them. This is the conception of natural law that we've discussed. But people can also fear the punishment for breaking human law. Even if they regard human laws as mere conventions with no divine grounding, the punishments can still be very real. Thucydides explains that neither of these offered any motivation during the plague. Quote, fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. As for the first, they judged it to be just the same whether they worshipped them or not, as they saw all alike perishing, and for the last, no one expected to live to be brought to trial for his offenses, but each felt that a far severe sentence had already passed upon them all and hung over their heads. And before this fell, it was only reasonable to enjoy life a little, end quote. Thucydides portrays the plague as causing a religious crisis. The efficacy of the gods was no longer believed in, since, despite repeated prayers and entreaties, they had not intervened and stopped the plague. Quote, supplications in the temples, divinations, and so forth were found futile. While Gilgamesh and Job loudly protest against the unfairness of the gods for failing to alleviate human suffering, the Athenians' reaction is one of resignation. They simply stop trying, but there's no rebuke of the gods for their lack of justice.